On the same week the West Virginia State Police put his name in a fraud bulletin, Patrick Roark walked right back up the dirt road to Betty Whittaker's house. Think about that. The state had just announced they were investigating a possible scheme involving money and merchandise sent on behalf of the Whittaker family. Two names were singled out: online creator Lawrence Eric Carroll and local fixer John Patrick Roark. Donors were urged to come forward with receipts, screenshots, proof. The world that once praised the helpers was suddenly being asked, "Are you sure your money ever reached this family?" At the same time, Adult Protective Services had stepped in. 3 of the most vulnerable Whittakers, Ray, Timmy, and Lorraine, were removed from the home and placed under state care. One day they were part of the daily rhythm of that house, the next they were gone. No dramatic farewell, no explanation that made sense to Betty. One moment crowded, the next hollow. And in that hollow space, Patrick appears again. He walks past the cameras that made the family famous. He steps onto the same warm porch that became a symbol of inbred America to millions of viewers. Inside there is no Ray grunting in confusion, no Timmy hovering nearby, no Lorraine moving through the room. There is just Betty, elderly, confused, traumatized, and suddenly alone in a house the internet swears it saved. Patrick sits beside her. He talks softly. He comforts her, explains, defends himself, tries to calm the panic she can't quite put into words. And the whole time, the lens is watching. So here is the question that cuts through everything. Why is he still there? If your name is now attached to a fraud investigation, if donors are being asked whether you mishandled their money, if the family at the heart of your story has been literally taken out of your hands by the state, why would you go back to that house? Why would you put yourself next to the one person left behind? The one who can't fully protect herself. The one whose pain still draws attention. Is it loyalty? Is it love? Is it guilt? Is it control? Everyone knows the Whittakers' tragedy by now. Everyone knows the viral label, the shocking footage, the comments joking about a family that never asked to be entertainment. But what most people don't know is what happened after the sirens, after the removal, after the police said the word fraud. This is not the story of how the Whittakers became famous. This is the story of what Patrick chose to do when the world started asking if the helpers had been helping themselves. This is the story of why, when Ray, Timmy, and Lorraine were taken, Patrick chose to stay with Betty. Chapter 2. When helping became a business. Long before Patrick's name appeared in any police bulletin, the Whittakers had already become an industry. It started as awareness, a shocking window into a forgotten corner of Appalachia. But awareness quickly turned into money. Millions of people watched, shared, and reacted. With every view came ad revenue. With every tearful comment came another donation. Boxes showed up. Cash was sent. People genuinely believed they were changing the family's life. To most donors, it felt simple. You see suffering, you send help. Someone you trust delivers it. Into that space stepped 2 men. Eric Carroll ran the online side. Channels, pages, updates, merch, membership platforms where fans could pay for extra content or even personalized messages supposedly from the family. Patrick Roark was the man on the ground. He lived in Odd. He knew the road, the family, the property. He could walk into that house, film updates, bring supplies, and tell the internet, here's what your donations are doing. He called himself a friend, a protector, someone who stepped in because others had failed the Whittakers for decades. Together, they helped turn the family name into a pipeline. Money went from viewers through platforms and accounts, then, according to them, down to the Whittakers. Patrick talked about agreements and percentages. A 3-way split between him, Carroll, and the family. Carroll claimed some funds were being managed carefully to avoid harming benefits or to set up something more stable. On camera, it looked like a win. The poorest, most vulnerable family on the internet finally had advocates. Off camera, the house told a different truth. Even after large waves of donations, reports and footage still showed the same decaying structure, the same heavy smells, the same danger underfoot. No clear visible transformation matched the scale of generosity pouring in. Relatives and neighbors asked why things looked almost the same when the story had grown so huge. Larry, another member of the family, began voicing frustration. Some supporters online started to ask a question they should have asked from the beginning. Who exactly controls this money? Every donation that wasn't clearly accounted for added weight to that question. Every new promise that never appeared on the ground created a crack in the trust between donors and the men speaking for the family. And standing at that fragile crossing point between the audience's belief and the family's reality was Patrick. Chapter 3. When the system stepped in. The whole structure finally shook when two powerful forces arrived at once: the state and the law. First came the intervention in the home. Adult Protective Services made the call. The conditions and vulnerabilities inside that house were serious enough that the state needed to step in. Ray, Timmy, and Lorraine were removed and placed under supervision. For the internet, it was just another update headline. For Betty, it was an earthquake. One day she is surrounded by the familiar chaos she has lived in for decades. The next, three of the people she cares about, people who depended on her, people she depended on, are simply gone. She doesn't control the decision. She doesn't sign papers with a full understanding of what they mean. She just loses them. Then comes the second force, the fraud investigation. In a public bulletin, the West Virginia State Police announced they are investigating a possible fraudulent scheme involving money and goods sent to the Whittakers through Eric Carroll and Patrick Roark. They urged donors to come forward with proof of payments to help trace where the support really went. For any honest middleman, that's terrifying. For any dishonest one, it's worse. Either way, it is a moment of reckoning. The timing is brutal. The family members who drew the most public attention have been removed, making the future of Whittaker content uncertain. At the same time, the past, every donation, every transaction, every package, is being pulled into question. It's at this exact moment that most people in Patrick's position would retreat. They'd delete posts, stay off camera, speak only through lawyers, and put distance between themselves and the house that has become both a symbol and a potential piece of evidence. Patrick does the opposite. He keeps showing up at the one place now loaded with more emotion and suspicion than anywhere else, Betty's house. For Betty, he might feel like the last person who didn't vanish. For the outside world, he is now both the helper and the suspect, sitting in the same living room where this entire story started to unravel. The state has taken her family. The police are asking questions. And the man at the center of that storm is holding her hand, telling her he's still here. Chapter 4. Why Patrick stayed. So why stay? Why, when the camera has turned into a weapon as much as a witness, would Patrick keep placing himself beside Betty in the very house that raised every red flag? Three overlapping reasons stand out. The first is reputation. Patrick insists he's not a thief. He says he cared, that he gave, that he didn't pocket the YouTube money people think he did. In that frame, disappearing now would look like a confession. Walking away from Betty when her family is taken and his name is under investigation would make every accusation feel true. By staying, he builds a different narrative. I didn't run. I kept helping when things were bad. I stayed loyal. Hours of footage of him bringing supplies, paying bills, sitting through her tears, those are powerful images if you ever need to convince the world you had a good heart. The second is control. Even with controversy, the story still has value. There are channels, back catalogs, memberships, and a built-in audience attached to the Whittaker name. Even if new donations slow down, Attention itself is a kind of currency. With Ray, Timmy, and Lorraine gone from the house, there's one person who can still center that attention, Betty. By staying close, Patrick remains the gatekeeper. He decides what updates get filmed, how the situation is framed, how the investigation is talked about, and how he himself appears. He can shape the emotional tone, tragic, unfair, misunderstood. He can cast himself as the last friend left, the only one still physically there in the aftermath. Walking away would mean giving up that control, not just over whatever money might still be flowing, but over the story itself. The third is legal survival. Fraud cases are not only about where the money went. They're about intent. Were you confused, careless, overwhelmed, or did you deliberately deceive people? If you're afraid of being painted as a villain, you want proof of involvement that looks like care, not exploitation. You want the world to see you as someone who kept showing up for a vulnerable woman, even when it cost you. Footage of Patrick comforting Betty, explaining things to her, still bringing what she needs after the removals. Those moments are not neutral. They are potential evidence either against him or for him. And then there's Betty herself. Her understanding of what happened, of who helped and who harmed, will be filtered through the people around her. If Patrick had vanished, someone else could have stepped in and filled that silence with their own conclusions about him. By staying, he has the chance to influence how she remembers, how she describes him, how she tells the story to anyone who asks. None of this proves what is in his heart. It doesn't settle whether he is guilty or innocent. But it does show this. His decision to keep helping Betty after everyone else was taken lines up almost perfectly with what someone would do if they needed to protect their image, preserve their influence, and defend themselves against a possible criminal case. Chapter 5. Betty and the people watching. Underneath all of this, beneath the headlines, the arguments, the investigations, there is still a woman sitting in that house. Betty didn't build this story. She didn't ask for a camera in her living room. She didn't ask to have her family turned into a spectacle or her grief turned into episodes. She didn't design donation links or negotiate splits or manage accounts. She woke up one day and the world knew her name. She woke up another day and the state had taken half of her family. Now, in the middle of all that, one man keeps appearing at her door. A man the state is investigating. A man who says he's her protector. His presence could be genuine care, calculated self-interest, or some painful mixture of both. For viewers, it's tempting to make this simple. Patrick is either the hero who stayed or the villain who couldn't afford to leave. But the truth is messier and more uncomfortable. Because this story isn't just about him. It's about us. We watched the Whittakers long before any investigation. We shared their videos. We joked. We gasped. We cried. So yes, this is the story of why Patrick Roark continued helping Betty after Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine were taken. But it's also a question we don't like to ask. When helping becomes content, who is really being protected? The story didn't end with Patrick staying. In many ways, that's where it truly began. After the removals, after the fraud bulletin, after the internet started sharpening its knives, the atmosphere around Betty's house changed. The porch that once held laughter, confusion, and routine became a place of waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for visits that never came. Waiting for phone calls that rang unanswered. And through all of that waiting, Patrick remained a constant presence. Betty clung to familiarity. Anyone would. When everything else is stripped away, the last familiar face becomes an anchor, even if that anchor is tied to the storm itself. Patrick knew this, whether consciously or instinctively. He knew that being there mattered more than anything he could say online. Being physically present carried weight that comments and statements never could. He brought groceries. He talked about the weather. He listened while Betty repeated the same questions again and again. Where are they? When will they come back? Why didn't anyone tell me? And every time she asked, he offered the same reassurances. They're okay. They're safe. This will get sorted out. Just give it time. Time became the most dangerous word in the story. Because while Betty waited, the world moved fast. Screenshots circulated. Old videos were rewatched with new suspicion. Viewers who once defended Patrick began scrutinizing every interaction, every receipt, every claim. Donors compared notes. Some realized they had sent money through platforms they no longer trusted. Others wondered why they never saw proof of what their generosity built. And yet, despite all that noise, Patrick continued filming small moments. Not the chaotic scenes of the past, but quieter ones. Him sitting beside Betty. Him fixing something small around the house. Him speaking calmly about how misunderstood everything was. These moments were carefully shaped, whether intentionally or not, to convey stability in the middle of collapse. The narrative shifted subtly. It was no longer just about helping the Whittakers. It became about loyalty. About who stayed when things got hard. About who didn't abandon Betty when the cameras turned hostile. But loyalty can look a lot like leverage when one person holds all the access. Betty didn't have a phone buzzing with opinions. She didn't read the comments sections dissecting her life. She didn't see the timelines or the side-by-side comparisons. What she saw was the man sitting across from her, telling her he hadn't left, telling her he was still fighting. And that matters. In legal terms, in emotional terms, and in narrative terms. Because Betty's voice, however limited or fragmented it may be, carries power. If she says Patrick helped her, stayed with her, supported her, those words will be repeated endlessly. They will be quoted. They will be framed as proof of character. Patrick understood that better than anyone. Meanwhile, the absence of Ray, Timmy, and Lorraine created a silence that couldn't be filled. Their removal wasn't just physical. It fractured the story itself. The Whittaker content that once revolved around family dynamics now had a single focal point, Betty. That concentration of attention made her more vulnerable, not less. Every update now revolved around her emotions. Her loneliness. Her confusion. Her heartbreak. And whoever controlled access to her controlled the story's emotional core. This is where lines blur. Is Patrick there because Betty needs someone? Or is Betty there because Patrick needs the story? Both things can be true at the same time. And that's what makes this situation so unsettling. Patrick often spoke about how the system failed the Whittakers. How APS didn't explain things properly. How outsiders judged a family without understanding their way of life. Those arguments resonated with viewers who already distrusted institutions. They also conveniently redirected focus away from questions about money, accountability, and transparency. When people asked about donations, Patrick talked about love. When people asked about receipts, he talked about trauma. When people asked about contracts, he talked about loyalty. None of those answers were necessarily lies. But they weren't answers either. Behind the scenes, Betty's world kept shrinking. Fewer visitors. Fewer voices. Fewer choices. And in that shrinking world, Patrick's role became outsized. Not because he declared it, but because circumstances handed it to him. This is how influence works in vulnerable spaces. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly. The cameras captured only fragments. A hug here. A conversation there. But what they couldn't capture was how dependency forms when alternatives disappear. When the state removes your family. When the internet debates your worth. When your life becomes evidence instead of experience. Betty didn't need a savior. She needed clarity, protection, and independent advocacy. But what she got was continuity. And continuity can feel like safety, even when it comes at a cost. As the investigation loomed, Patrick's continued presence served another purpose. It signaled confidence. People who are guilty, viewers often say, don't stick around. They disappear. They hide. They lawyer up and vanish. Patrick didn't vanish. He stayed visible. He stayed close. He stayed involved. And that visibility complicated everything. Supporters pointed to it as proof of innocence. Critics saw it as manipulation. Authorities saw it as context. And Betty saw it as the only thing that hadn't changed. The tragedy here isn't just about whether Patrick did something wrong or right. It's about how easily care and control can become indistinguishable when one person holds all the power in the room. By the time people began asking harder questions about consent, about representation, about whether Betty truly understood the situation she was in, the pattern was already set. Patrick was the interpreter, the messenger, the familiar voice. And breaking that pattern would mean another rupture in Betty's already fractured life. So the question shifts again. Not just why did Patrick stay, but what did his staying cost Betty in the long run? Because in stories like this, the loudest presence often drowns out the quietest needs. And the quietest person in the room is almost always the one paying the highest price. And as the investigation continued, as more eyes turned toward West Virginia, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just a story about fraud or fame or betrayal. It was a story about power, who holds it, who needs it, and who is left without it when the dust settles. And that story was far from over. As the weeks passed, the cracks widened in ways that couldn't be patched over with reassurance or presence alone. The investigation didn't stay confined to official bulletins and quiet phone calls. It seeped into conversations, into whispers between donors, into the uneasy pauses whenever Patrick tried to explain why nothing tangible ever seemed to materialize for the Whittakers despite the flood of attention and money. People began reconstructing timelines. Not emotionally, but methodically. When did the first large donations come in? When were promises made about repairs, rebuilding, relocation? What actually changed on the ground during those periods? The answers were uncomfortable, not because they were dramatic, but because they were vague. And vagueness is dangerous when real lives are involved. For Betty, vagueness was nothing new. She had lived her entire life inside systems that were never explained to her, rules she was expected to follow without understanding. Forms, officials, cameras, promises, all of it blurred together. What she understood clearly was loss. The empty chairs, the quiet rooms, the absence of voices she had heard every day for decades. Patrick filled some of that silence. Not all of it. No one could. But enough that his absence would have been felt immediately. And that gave him weight. Not authority in an official sense, but emotional gravity. He became the person she looked to when something didn't make sense, which was almost always. This is where the imbalance deepened. Every time Betty asked about Ray, Timmy, or Lorraine, Patrick answered. Every time she asked about money, about the house, about when things would go back to normal, Patrick framed the response. And framing matters. It shapes memory. It shapes belief. It shapes what a person repeats when someone else asks them later. Outside that house, a very different conversation was happening. Donors compared screenshots. Some realized they had given multiple times through different platforms, believing they were helping directly. Others noticed that requests for transparency were met with defensiveness instead of clarity. A few came forward quietly to authorities, not out of anger, but confusion. They didn't want punishment. They wanted understanding. Where did it go? That question hovered over everything. Patrick continued to insist that he had done nothing wrong, that money had been used responsibly, that the system, not him, had failed the family. Eric said similar things elsewhere. Both leaned heavily on intent. They meant well. They tried. Things were complicated. Intent, however, does not replace accountability. And accountability was what Betty never received. No one sat her down and explained what money came in under her family's name. No one showed her balances, breakdowns, or timelines she could understand. She was told things were handled. She was told not to worry. She was told people were taking care of it. That phrase, taking care of it, had followed her all her life. It was always said by someone else. As pressure increased, Patrick's tone began to shift in subtle ways. He spoke more about being misunderstood, about being targeted, about how the internet always needs a villain. These statements weren't necessarily false, but they served another purpose. They reframed scrutiny as persecution. And when scrutiny becomes persecution, questions become attacks. That framing created a protective bubble around Patrick and, by extension, around Betty. Anyone questioning the situation could now be portrayed as hurting her, stressing her, exploiting her pain. The irony was hard to miss. The same justification used to defend involvement could also silence legitimate concern. Betty didn't know about these debates. She didn't see the arguments unfold, but she felt their effects. Fewer visitors came by. Fewer helpers reached out. People hesitated. No one wanted to be accused of causing more harm. Isolation returned, wearing a different mask. The system, meanwhile, moved slowly. Investigations do. Paperwork replaced spectacle. Interviews replaced comments. Evidence replaced emotion. And during that long, quiet process, Patrick's presence took on another meaning. He wasn't just helping Betty survive day to day. He was becoming part of the record. Every interaction mattered now. Every statement. Every video. Every decision to stay or leave. And Betty, whether she understood it or not, was no longer just a person living her life. She was a witness. A reference point. A human anchor in a case that extended far beyond her porch. That is a heavy role for anyone, let alone someone who never asked to be here. The hardest truth in all of this is that harm doesn't require malice. You can hurt someone while believing you're helping them. You can take control while telling yourself it's for their good. And you can stay when leaving might actually give someone the space to regain agency. Patrick may genuinely believe he did the right thing by staying. He may believe Betty needed him. He may believe that walking away would have been abandonment. But belief does not erase consequence. What Betty needed most after the removals wasn't just familiarity. It was independence. Advocacy without strings. Support without narrative control. Someone whose role didn't depend on her story continuing. Instead, she remained at the center of a storm she didn't understand, surrounded by people who spoke for her more often than they listened to her. And that is the part of this story that lingers. Not the investigation. Not the accusations. Not the online outrage. But the quiet reality of a woman whose life became a battleground for reputation, legality, and perception long after the cameras arrived and long before they left. If there is anything to take from this chapter, it is this. Help that cannot withstand transparency is not help, it is influence. And influence over vulnerable people carries a responsibility that cannot be explained away with good intentions. As this story moves forward, as outcomes emerge and truths are clarified, one question should remain at the center of every discussion. Who was truly protected, and who was simply convenient to protect? Share your thoughts below. By the time everything reaches this stage, the real consequences are no longer dramatic or visible. They are quiet, slow, and deeply personal. They don't show up in headlines or court summaries. They live in the spaces left behind when people are removed, when trust collapses, and when a life becomes something others argue over rather than protect. For Betty, the future no longer feels like something she can shape. It feels suspended, managed by decisions she didn't make and explanations she didn't fully understand. The house still stands, but it no longer functions as a home in the way it once did. Rooms feel larger not because they've changed, but because the people who filled them are gone. Silence has replaced routine, and that silence is heavy. In that emptiness, the presence of one remaining figure takes on outsized importance. Patrick's continued involvement may look like loyalty to some and manipulation to others, but what matters most is the imbalance it creates. When someone becomes the sole constant in a vulnerable person's world, that person gains influence whether they intend to or not. Influence over perception. Influence over memory. Influence over how the story is told and retold. Betty is not in a position to weigh motivations or calculate long-term consequences. She is reacting to loss, to confusion, to fear. Comfort, even imperfect comfort, feels better than being alone. That reality does not make her weak. It makes her human. But it also means that those around her carry a responsibility far heavier than simply showing up. True support does not center itself. It does not require visibility. It does not need to be documented to be valid. It creates independence rather than dependency. And most importantly, it leaves space for choice. Betty has not been given many choices. The public, too, has to sit with an uncomfortable truth. This situation didn't spiral overnight. It didn't begin with allegations or removals. It began with attention, with curiosity, with fascination framed as concern. Millions watched the Whittakers long before anyone questioned the structure behind the help. Donations flowed faster than accountability. Trust was extended without safeguards. When the story was uplifting, few asked hard questions. When it became disturbing, outrage replaced reflection. But outrage is easy. Responsibility is harder. Platforms profited from engagement. Creators profited from visibility. Even critics built followings by reacting to the fallout. Meanwhile, the Whittakers lost privacy, autonomy, and eventually each other. Their name became something others used to gain traction, credibility, or income. And once that happened, the family themselves became secondary to the narrative built around them. When the system finally intervened, it wasn't responding to internet debates. It was responding to conditions on the ground. By then, the damage was already layered: emotional, psychological, and social. Removing family members solved one problem while creating others. It didn't restore stability. It fragmented it. Patrick's decision to remain after the removals will always be interpreted through whatever lens the viewer brings with them. Some will see a man who didn't abandon an elderly woman. Others will see someone who couldn't afford to step away. Both interpretations can exist at the same time. Human behavior under pressure is rarely clean or singular. What cannot be ignored is that staying preserved influence. It kept him close to the center of the story at a moment when distance might have allowed clarity. It ensured that his voice, his framing, and his presence continued to shape how events were understood by Betty and by the audience watching from afar. That matters, because proximity creates power, especially when the other person is isolated. None of this proves guilt. None of it proves innocence. But it does reveal how fragile ethical lines become when attention, money, and vulnerability intersect. It shows how easily help can slide into control without anyone consciously choosing that outcome. And beneath all of this, there is still a woman who never asked for any of it. Betty didn't ask to be documented. She didn't ask to be analyzed. She didn't ask to become a symbol or a controversy. She lived her life quietly for decades, and then suddenly her existence became content. Her grief became discussion. Her confusion became footage. She is now living with the consequences of a story she did not write. As investigations move forward and public opinion continues to shift, it is tempting to reduce everything to sides. To decide who is right and who is wrong. But doing that too quickly risks repeating the same mistake that started this cycle in the first place, centering spectators instead of the people most affected. This story is not just about one man staying or leaving. It is about what happens when vulnerable lives are placed inside systems designed for exposure rather than care. It is about what happens when good intentions are not paired with structure, boundaries, and accountability. Real help is quiet. It doesn't disappear when scrutiny arrives. It doesn't depend on being believed. It doesn't require loyalty in return. And it never leaves someone with fewer choices than they had before. That is the standard this situation should be measured against. Betty deserved support that protected her independence, not just her comfort. The Whittakers deserved help that strengthened their stability, not their visibility. And the public deserved transparency before trust was asked of them. What happens next will matter, not just in legal terms, but in human ones. Because long after investigations end and attention moves on, Betty will still be living with the outcome. And the only question worth asking now is this: did the help she received make her safer, or did it simply make her easier to stand beside? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.